Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? We'll do a little sound adjustment. Let me know up or down if needed. So I want to commend you all for coming out tonight. You were the brave. For the weather, I know when I was driving up, the weather started and the world stopped. So thank you for being here. My name is Megan Krueger, and I'm the Cultural Arts Manager for the Economic Development Department. And I'd like to welcome you to tonight's Imagine Austin Speaker Series. The mission of the Imagine Austin Speaker Series is to promote and implement the Imagine Austin Comprehensive Plan and its 8 priority programs. The event is being hosted tonight by the City of Austin's Planning and Development Review Department and in partnership with the Economic Development Department Cultural Arts Division. I want to just take a brief moment to recognize our fearless leadership, Sylnovia Holt-Rabb, who is our Assistant Director for the Economic Development Department. If you could raise your hand. And I also see in the audience Greg Guernsey, our Department Director of Planning Development Review. Am I missing anyone? So tonight's speaker it's a kickoff. Really, it's the third of a 3-part speaker series around creative placemaking, and I'm really honored to get to introduce our speaker tonight. Before I do, I want to put this in context of what our department does, the Economic Development Department. And I'm actually really excited to share with you a recent change by the federal government in terms of how they define economic development. And you'll see it here, so I won't read it. But what I find interesting is that they are sort of expanding the notion of what economic development means. And in this case, it's focusing on the quality of life of people and really focusing on the human capital and what that means in terms of innovation for our country. And that's what creates a robust economic or economy. So I wanted to share that with you. It's kind of hot off the press if you haven't seen it. And also just a really brief overview of our department. We have what we're now calling 5 creative teams. I love that. They've adopted the cultural arts sort of mission that all things can be creative in terms of how you approach them. Of the 5 divisions, there's Global Business Recruitment and Expansion, the Cultural Arts Division, Small Business Development Program, Redevelopment Division, Music and Entertainment Division. And what I want to point out is that there are several efforts, even within these 5 divisions, that has a part and a role to play with the city's creative placemaking. For example, Redevelopment Division is now launching a commercial revitalization strategy, looking at how to revitalize areas that will include urban planning, city planning, arts and culture. So we're working really closely with them. The Music and Entertainment Division has Hope Farmer Market First Live Sundays. I know the Small Business Development launched their Family Business Loan Program, which is helping businesses get access to capital, which is also helping for the thriving neighborhood centers. And our own Art in Public Places program, which is about integrating arts and culture into the built environment and creating place. So that's just a brief overview of our division, of our department. And we're also pleased to say that we've, just in 1 year, had some pretty significant major accomplishments. Some of them include the executing the Athena Health and WebSense agreements, which resulted in 1,077 full-time jobs. We were awarded a Gold Excellence in Economic Development in the category of Responding to Globalization from International Economic Development Council out of all major cities worldwide. We were awarded a Gold Excellence in Economic Development in the category of Promoting Local Business from IEDC out of all the major cities. We've also recently forged the Toronto-Austin Music Alliance, which is the first of its kind, which is music specific, and they're now modeling a music department on Austin's division. And recently sold the first of 4 parcels in the Green Water Treatment Plant project for $15 million to build 40,000 square feet of retail and office and a 38-story apartment tower. And then that comes to really why we're here today. We're also really pleased a couple of months ago to be able to announce that Austin was the recipient, and I use Austin globally to include all of our citizens and primarily our partners, which I'm going to recognize in a minute, 2 Art Place America grants. The first one, $400,000 to prototype a creative community with Fusebox, developers of Think East Creative District and Bullseye Business Development to transform a jet fuel storage tank area in the middle of a neighborhood into a creative, thriving area. And Brad Carlin, where are you? He is with Fusebox. I want you, everyone to see who you are, because it's an amazing accomplishment. We're really looking forward to seeing how that unfolds. And then also, we were awarded $256,500 from Art Place America in partnership with Go Collaborative and other arts partners to map the cultural assets within the city. It will be citywide, and we will be able to present this in context of the new 10-1 single member districts that we will be entering into in January. And we'll also be building onto the commercial revitalization strategy with that. And then again, even more recently, we were the recipient of an NEA Our Town grant in partnership with Creative Action, which they're working on, they're developing within the social profit development with Will Meredith's team on the east side in the Go Valley neighborhood. So let's come to why we're here today. Tonight culminates the launch of our creative placemaking conversation, and I have to say, this again being the third, I've seen a really rich conversation happening, not only with our really brilliant speakers who have come to town, but also among the community, really starting to make those connections with each other. And when I talk about cross-collaboration between divisions, it goes well beyond that. I want to mention tomorrow is National Parking Day, and so Congress Avenue is going to come alive, and it takes various fields of expertise to come together to build those places that are special. So if you have a chance, stop by and see that tomorrow. And so I also want to say, if you connect with someone here, don't let this be the last time that you visit with these folks, exchange numbers, because that's how ideas get sparked and projects happen. So Mark Stern is Kenneth L. M. Prey Professor of Social Policy and History and co-director of the Urban Studies program at the University of Pennsylvania. A historian by training, he has taught social welfare policy since 1980. His scholarship covers United States social history, social welfare policy, and the impact of the arts and culture on urban neighborhoods. Stern is co-founder and principal investigator of the social impact of the Arts Project, and the acronym is SIAP, a policy research group at Penn's School of Social Policy and Practice. SIAP conducts research on the role of arts and culture in American cities, with a particular interest in strategies for arts-based revitalization. So I'm very pleased to welcome Mark Stern. Please give him a warm welcome. Thank you.
I can't believe this. Is this on? Can you hear me? Oh. You can hear me now? Better? All right, right in front of me. It's great to be here. I understand there hasn't been any rain in Austin for months and months and months, so I don't believe that. Based on my experience, it rains all the time. Am I up? I'm up. 1 second. I want to report today, and I want to thank the folks from the city who were involved in inviting us to come in for this. We've had a great day meeting with people, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your response to what I talk about today. Essentially, I'm going to report about a research project, a summer research project that my colleague Susan Seibert and I started in 1994. And we're hoping to finish it sometime in the next 5 or 10 years. Essentially, I want to make 2 points. I'm having a struggle because I'm a wanderer, but I feel like I have to stay in one place. So you'll bear with me if I sway back and forth because I want to break loose. I essentially want to talk about two things today. Over the past few years, as we've done this work in Philadelphia and a few other cities, we've developed this idea of what we call natural cultural districts. The idea that if you look at a city, there are places in a city where you find concentrations of cultural assets, and that these neighborhoods are both the driver of the cultural sector, but also the places where you see the most profound impact of arts and culture in terms of other elements of society. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about what we found out about natural cultural districts, some of the features that characterize them. The second point I want to make, which really builds off the natural cultural district work, is just in the last few years, we've been focusing on what we refer to as social well-being, a more integrated approach to thinking about all the ways that one can have a desirable or good life in as you live it, and the connection between social well-being and the presence of arts and cultural institutions in a particular neighborhood. So first I'm going to walk through how we've done that index, and then some of really what are our initial findings in terms of the connections between social well-being and arts and culture. So essentially the model, this is the model that has been obsessing us since 1994. How do you take these three ingredients? The presence of cultural assets economic development, and social well-being, and look at the relationship between those. One of the things that I think has come out of our research, and I think is one of the things that links the three talks that have been part of this series, is that they all happen in a place. So when you bring together these assets in a particular place, that's, in a sense, what's been driving this conversation about creative placemaking. However, let me say that based on our work, we've had a concern, and that's the next slide, which is social well-being tends to drop out of that conversation very easily. In a city like Philadelphia, we understand it because while it may not be a dying city, it's certainly a struggling city. And it's very hard to get public officials' attention unless you can demonstrate that what you're doing is going to create jobs and expand the tax base. But I think those phenomena, we find that same kind of attention deficit in talking to public policy people in many places. So one of our concerns, and one of the things we've been interested in kind of highlighting, is that if you drop out that piece of social well-being, that you're missing, first of all, much of the unique contribution that the arts can make to a neighborhood. And most important, you're missing a lot of kind of what those ripple effects are and how those affect the neighborhood. So essentially, I better not look at those. Essentially, I want to look at what we see as two kind of problems associated with this exclusive focus on economic development. First of all, is there enough pure economic benefit from the arts to justify the kind of public and philanthropic investments that people would like to see? And secondly, distributional issues. If we just focus on the economic development payoff of the arts, are we setting ourselves up for benefits that are only going to serve a certain portion of the community and not really promote a kind of shared prosperity focus? So those are the 2 points I want to look at as we go through. So let me start with sort of a brief history of some of the efforts over the past decade or two to look at this issue of the arts and economic development. So during the 90s, really, there was a quite big vogue for what were called economic impact of the arts studies. And those originally started as you sort of add up all of the possible ways that the arts made, hiring and and then you'd apply a multiplier effect to get essentially some really big number. And the whole focus of those economic impact studies was to generate that really big number. But if you think about that, there are a variety of problems. First of all, the economists started pointing out that this wasn't really a very sound methodology, that you needed to take into consideration what they call substitution effects. That is, that all the money that was spent to the arts just wouldn't have disappeared otherwise, but would have been used in other ways. The problem I had with it was that, and we've seen this in our city, which is that if all you focus on is the purely economic impact of the arts, then you're reducing it to essentially, well, if something else can produce a greater economic impact, that's really what will pay off. So like in our city, and I think maybe not just in our cities, casinos seem to be able to produce a bigger number than the arts, so they get a lot of attention. So again, by focusing purely on economic impact, we're going to miss much of what the real kinds of impact that the arts makes in neighborhoods and makes in a region overall. You know, and again, if you do those studies right, one of the things you find, this is some data on a study that was done in Connecticut where they actually were very thorough in terms of following through all the costs and benefits of an arts, and they came up essentially with a negative number. So again, that focus on economic impact, I think, doesn't really get us very far unless we put it in the context of a broader notion of social well-being. The economic impact studies have become less popular, and really were, I think, what supplanted them really over the past decade has been this focus on the creative class that's associated with the work of Richard Florida. There are a lot of things you can say about Florida's work. I will say one of the things where I think it's really made a very strong contribution to the dialogue is by saying that to understand how the arts influences a community, you really do have to understand the sociological connections that are associated with the arts. However, I've been sort of concerned with some of the way it's been used. And again, in terms of our own work, what's most concerned us about that is that essentially if you adopt a creative class approach, you're essentially saying that resources should be diverted particularly for the care and feeding of this creative class. So in a city, again, in a city like Philadelphia, where we have a 27% poverty rate, where we have collapsing infrastructure all over the place, to then say you're going to divert a significant portion of resources to make sure that the city was sufficiently cool creates a struggle and sets up a distributional struggle that I don't think really benefits creativity generally. Great. You know, and one of the things that's concerned us, I mean, it's great that Arts Place America has been awarding grants in Austin. I've been having a bit of a struggle with them. Jamie Bennett, who's the current executive director, has planted himself in our seminar room in the Urban Studies program for hours at a time, trying to work through some of these concerns. But one of the things that did concern us was that you can see in the model of their kind of theory of action that they really have, to some extent, dropped off those social benefits. And what we're trying to work with them about is reinsert those, because it certainly doesn't show up. So as I said, what I want to talk primarily about today is the work we've been doing, for the most part in Philadelphia, although we've been branching out into other cities. First of all, in terms of identifying both the social and the economic impact of the value added that the arts makes. Secondly, to focus on this notion of natural cultural districts as we've developed it. And then finally, this work on social well-being. So, what do we mean by natural cultural districts? As I said, essentially this is a bottom-up concept where instead of going out and drawing a line around a map and saying that's a cultural district and then filling it in, what we've been struck by is the fact that these neighborhoods already exist in cities and that there's a set of payoffs associated with them. So we've been, so that's really it. And this concept that's up here, this notion of cultural ecology, that how a set of cultural resources come together and interact in a particular place has been really critical for our understanding in terms of how these districts work. However, we've discovered, in fact, that certainly there isn't just one kind of natural cultural districts. We've had this experience where I'll have a set of students working with me over the summer, and we'll look at the map and we'll say, here are a couple of districts we want to investigate. I'll send my students out to do field work in them, and they'll come back after a couple of days and they'll say, Professor Stern, you're wrong. That's not a natural cultural district. There are no coffee shops. The people hanging out on the street aren't sufficiently cool. So there's this notion that there's a stereotype of what a cultural district should look like, and the fact that all the districts that exist in a particular city don't fit that stereotype is, in a sense, something we have to overcome. What's been one of the areas, again, because of our concerns around distribution and social justice, we've been particularly interested in districts in low-income neighborhoods that show this characteristics. In fact, we developed a method where we tried to identify districts that were facing significant locational and economic difficulties. They were far from center city, they had high poverty rate, low economic resource, but still had significant concentrations of cultural districts. That's what we refer to here as the civic clusters. And one of the arguments I want to make today is that these civic clusters are particularly important if we're going to make a case for the role of the arts in terms of addressing issues of economic justice as we move forward. And I'll be talking more about that a little later. First of all, I'm going to get away from the microphone here, but how many of you have been to Philadelphia? Because I'm going to show all sorts of maps. So I know the videographer is going to go crazy, but I'm going to go over here for a second and talk really loudly. So this is Center City. Most of the neighborhoods that Most of the neighborhoods that Susan and I do our work in are probably neighborhoods you haven't been to. West Philadelphia, North Philadelphia, and some spots down here in South Philadelphia. These, as I mentioned, Philadelphia has a very high poverty rate. And these neighborhoods, which are predominantly African American and Latino neighborhoods, are places where over time we've seen a significant amount of cultural activity associated with what we refer to as these civic clusters. One thing I wanted to talk about as we look at these natural cultural districts, we did a study a few years ago comparing these districts in 3 cities, Seattle, Baltimore, and Philadelphia. And there's a variety of lessons that came out of that I wanted to talk about. First of all, there were some features that we noted in terms of the cultural sector that cut across all those cities. And one of the things, if we have a chance to talk about later on, I'd be interested in people's reaction to whether you see these things happening in Austin as well. So I have them up here. But first of all, we've seen a real fuzziness of the line between nonprofits and for-profits. We run into artists who are a nonprofit in the morning, a for-profit in the afternoon, and an informal sector person in the evening. So that notion that this clear demarcation seems to have given way. At the same time, we've seen this fuzziness or fuzzing of the boundaries between different arts disciplines and how those operate. It used to be that when we developed our inventory of arts groups, we tried to assign a particular discipline to them. And at some point, we more or less gave up on that because those labels tended to be misleading because, the groups would say, well, we're not just that, we do this and this and this. So that, again, that notion that there's neat boundaries around disciplines also seems to be giving way to some extent. In terms of the nonprofit sector, I think this has been one thing that's really been striking us as because it has a particular impact in terms of middle-sized groups in middle or low-income neighborhoods, which is this fact that middle-sized groups are finding themselves under incredible pressure, and we use that to be around, say, $1 million to $2 million. Is that to $5 million? A little less. So essentially, these size groups neither have the kind of nimbleness and flexibility that really small groups have that rely more on voluntary labor and don't necessarily have a big infrastructure to keep up. And they don't have the kind of pull of resources that really large groups. So as we look at the development of the cultural sector over the past 20 years, in Philadelphia at least, we're seeing that these are the groups that are greatest pressure and in some cases are closing over time. And then finally, in some of this work, we were asked to look at how facilities, kind of strategies that groups are using around facilities in these neighborhoods. And one of the things that we've learned from that is this notion of the connection of one group to one facility as a model has been giving way. And we're seeing more a separation of those people who are focusing on facilities from those people who are focusing on the arts, rather than having the artists learn how to be property managers. So let me talk a little bit about some of the specific features of natural cultural districts that we've learned. First of all, there are some issues in terms of the built environment. There are particular kinds of neighborhoods that seem to be likely to become natural cultural districts. And they're neighborhoods, I guess you'd say they're kind of repurposing neighborhoods. There's a built environment that's sort of a legacy of an older economic or social era. In Philadelphia, we have lots of these neighborhoods. But that there's also a sense of new beginnings in these neighborhoods. Either a neighborhood like Chinatown, North Callow Hill, where we see a kind of old, gritty industrial area attracting new uses, including arts uses, or a neighborhood like South Philadelphia, which has a long legacy as an immigrant receiving area and in a sense is going through a renaissance because of a new wave of immigrants that are now coming into the area. So that notion of there being kind of a kind of built environment that encourages these areas. A second issue that comes out has to do with the place area, the placeness of these areas. And what we found is that they occupy a particular cultural niche, that they're likely to be close to arts resources like art schools, that they have multiple kinds of diversity, economic diversity, ethnic diversity, household diversity that contributes to them. And finally, and this was a surprise, we found that these natural cultural districts had a funny property profile. That is, if you look at most of the city, if you find neighborhoods with high rates of rental, they tend to also have low economic status. And what we discovered was that natural cultural districts are most likely to combine a middling economic status with a higher rental percentage than you would expect given where they are economically. And there's a part of that makes total sense. By having a large rental market, you're allowing for the kind of flexibility and flow that these neighborhoods enjoy. Finally, and this comes out of kind of core urban studies belief. Jane Jacobs, in her classic study of death and life of American cities, contrasted this notion of what she called gradual money and cataclysmic money. That you find two ways that a neighborhood revitalizes itself. In one case, you have cataclysmic money, where suddenly huge amounts of money flow into a neighborhood, tearing up the social fabric and bringing about economic change, but also bringing about a breaking apart of the social fabric that used to be that. As against gradual money, where you have a slow infusion of money that helps a neighborhood rebuild. One of the things we've seen in terms of the natural cultural districts in which we've done our work is that there's some very deliberate efforts to use gradual money to bring that about. Now, it's easier in a city like Philadelphia where economic vitality isn't common, so that it becomes easier to have gradual market. But one of the interesting things we've discovered is that one of the critical features in terms of maintaining these natural cultural districts and keeping them from kind of attracting cataclysmic money has to do with the fact that arts groups, as they get in, are able to purchase their facilities. So that there are neighborhoods in Philadelphia today that would have stopped being a cultural district by now if it weren't for the fact that the groups that got in early were able to buy and maintain themselves in that neighborhood. So once I talk about economic vitality and arts groups, inevitably the issue of gentrification comes up. And one of the things we've discovered is that what I refer to as this Soho model, that notion that a bunch of artists move in, real estate properties go up, they push out the old residents and the old uses. They're followed by a group of kind of better off professionals and managers, and ultimately the artists are pushed out as well. There are certainly places in the country, in most cities, where you can find evidence of that model. But in our work, we haven't been convinced that this is the most common model in terms of the way arts districts develop. So you end up with what I'm calling here this Goldilocks challenge. How do we build up these cultural districts so they're not too cold, but also not too hot? We've been doing some work over the past few years, actually just this past year, to try to document more clearly what's going on in terms of these patterns of displacement in Philadelphia and then apply them to other cities. So it turns out that you can use some of the newer census data to actually measure how many people are moving in and out of a neighborhood over the course of a year. So in addition to just looking at the net change in the population of a neighborhood, we can actually get a sense of the churn, how many people with high educational credentials are moving out, moving in, and by varied groups. So we've been using these data to get a better sense of where what we're referring to as this kind of churn phenomenon is going on. Neighborhoods that are clearly experiencing a kind of displacement. So we've come up with these two kind of standards of that. First of all, what we're referring to here is educational churn. So an educational churn neighborhood is one where over the course of a couple of years, we see a significant number of high educational people moving into the neighborhood and people with low educational credentials moving out of the neighborhood. And, and again, this is a map of that. You can see there's a high concentration of those in Center City and neighborhoods immediately around it. That's really, and then some smaller elements of that farther out from Center City. We've also, the second dimension of geographic mobility we've been looking at is race. And again, the map looks pretty much the same. These are neighborhoods in which we're experiencing a significant number of African Americans and Latinos moving out of a neighborhood and a large number of non-Hispanic whites moving into the neighborhood. So we've been working on this, and I've got to say at this point I would call these preliminary results. But one thing we've discovered, is that neighborhoods that have high concentration of cultural resources and neighborhoods that experiencing a high amount of geographic mobility share a common set of characteristics. They have a lot of people with BAs, or they have again that feature of renters with high incomes. They have adults with BAs, and finally, they have very high concentrations of young adults. If we control for all of those features that they share in common, we find very little evidence that cultural assets on their own are providing a significant element of producing that displacement effect. So again, it's a preliminary result, but by and large, the data at this point don't really support the conclusion that arts and culture are really generating the kind of displacement. Well, in a sense, there's a a sense of that because the same forces that are associated with that displacement are associated with the presence of cultural resources. But I don't think we can demonstrate that they have that kind of causal effect that people have suggested. Let me move on to talk a little bit about social well-being. Well, to transition from natural cultural districts to social well-being. As I mentioned, one of the goals of the Social Impact of the Arts Project from the start was to show the correlation between the presence of cultural resources in a neighborhood and the kind of social benefits associated with that. Honestly, when we started doing this, we were, maybe groping's the wrong word, but we were essentially looking for what there was out there what kinds of data there were that we could use to look at this connection. So our approach was essentially to find whatever data we could on certain kinds of social outcomes and see if there was an association between those outcomes and the presence of cultural resources in the neighborhood. So for example, this graph shows some data we were able to get some data from some public health researchers in Philadelphia that had developed this index of what they called social stress, which was based on a variety of the presence of high numbers of teen births, low weight births in a neighborhood, the presence of high rates of child abuse and neglect cases in particular neighborhoods. So we were able to look at that data and compare it to the presence of cultural resources in the neighborhood. And we found, as this shows, a fairly strong relationship between those two, even when we controlled for the impact of the role of income in terms of that relationship. Similarly, we found some data, we were able to get some data from the city on the presence of cases of ethnic and racial harassment in the city. And again, we found a very strong case. Now, it turned out, in this case, the strongest predictor of if a neighborhood was going to have a high number of cases of ethnic and racial harassment was that the neighborhood was going through ethnic change. So a neighborhood that had been predominantly white and now was becoming Latino was much more likely to have these cases reported than more stable or homogeneous parts of the city. But in any event, looking at those neighborhoods that were going through this change, the presence of cultural resources in that neighborhood much reduced the likelihood that they would have these kind of cases. So that again, that relationship between the presence of cultural resources and a particular kind of social benefit was demonstrated in those data. And then finally, we did some work with a community development financial institution in Philadelphia, the Reinvestment Fund. They produced what they call an index of market value analysis, which looks at changes of housing markets over time. And we were able to use their data to say, well, to what extent are neighborhoods that are seen their housing market improve associated with the presence of cultural resources in the neighborhood? And I've got to say, if the relationship, I almost didn't believe how strong that relationship was when we did the analysis. But essentially, again, neighborhoods that were going through, this was, of course, before the recession, improvement in their housing market were associated with the presence of cultural resource. Over the same period as well, we found that neighborhoods with high concentrations of cultural resources also saw their poverty rate drop much higher than other neighborhoods in the city. So as I said, someone's telling me something. As I said, when we've been doing this research over the years, we've been sort of going around looking for ways to connect arts and culture to a variety of kinds of social benefits. Over the past few years, however, we thought it was important to bring a kind of systematic and integrated approach to talking about this notion of social well-being and the arts. We were stimulated in terms of doing this by some work that was being done primarily in Europe on the issue of social well-being. There was this very influential report and the work of scholars like Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum sort of put out this notion that social well-being should be conceptualized as a multidimensional phenomenon, that it isn't just about GDP at the national level, it isn't just about income at the individual level, but that we need to understand a whole variety of different dimensions of social well-being. And this really suited us because, again, we'd been working for so long to say it wasn't just about the economy, that it isn't just about the economic impact of the arts, that it gave us a more systematic way of thinking about how the arts would connect to a whole different set of ways of thinking about what constituted a good life. So again, we developed a data set that pulled together a variety of sources, and I'm really hoping, yes, oh, sorry, and essentially ended up with a conceptualization of social well-being that essentially had 13 different dimensions. And you can see these range from things like economic well-being, which includes income, educational attainment, a whole set of dimensions based on what came out of some of this earlier work people called social connections. We found that there were actually some different dimensions actually within that notion of social connection, ranging from neighborhoods where there was a high concentration of nonprofit organizations, creating one dimension of that. And then another dimension that we were able to get because of some survey data where we found this concentration of what we called face-to-face social connections. So we found neighborhoods where there was a high level, where residents reported high amount of trust in their neighbors. They felt like they were involved in community groups in their neighborhood. They felt like they belonged in their neighborhood and worked with their neighbors. And you can see there was also then, again, a whole set of public health dimensions associated with this, ranging from personal health based on measures of personal disease to access to health, which we measured in terms of the percentage of the population that had insurance or that didn't rely primarily on emergency rooms for their health care, to what we ended up calling a measure of social stress, which again focused on phenomenon like concentration, lack of prenatal care, reported cases of abuse and neglect. And then, you can see a whole variety of other dimensions that went into this index. I should point out at this point, in case it hasn't just occurred to you already, that this was a tremendous amount of work. Sometimes I wonder why we got into it, but fortunately, one of the benefits of being at a university is that you always have many eager and hardworking undergraduates and graduate students. We had 2 years of workshops in a seminar I co-taught with the policy director at the Reinvestment Fund, in which we had students working with us to pull together the data that supported these different dimensions. So let me just go through some of these. And here's what I want you to focus on. Sorry. You'll notice that in certain places the maps look very consistently the same. So for example, if you look at Center City, you'll see that it comes across with certain areas, certain consistency across maps. Then there are other neighborhoods in which we see consistency. We see consistency in the other direction, where we see consistently kind of low scores in terms of these. And again, if you look here in North Philadelphia, you'll see that. However, if you look at other neighborhoods in the city, what you're going to see is that you don't see that consistency, that you see mix, where on certain dimensions a neighborhood's doing quite well. On other dimensions, it's not doing well at all. So that's part of it. So this is that economic well-being. It's probably the map that's best known, because it essentially reflects the map on income, poverty, educational attainment. So that's, in a sense, that economic well-being dimension that kind of people kind of know about. As I mentioned, we had 3 dimensions of what we called social connections. This is the one that was based on our cultural asset index. And maybe I should say a word about that. Essentially, we gather data systematically at the block group level on 4 different dimensions of cultural assets: nonprofit cultural institutions, for-profit cultural firms, where artists live, and where cultural participants come from. So that last one we are able to develop by gathering data from literally dozens, literally hundreds actually, of cultural organizations in terms of memberships, people who buy tickets, people who subscribe to different events. So we're able to put all that data together to get a sense of where in the city cultural participants are coming from. We put all 4 of those indexes together, and we're able to generate a single index that tells us where in the city we see this strongest concentration of cultural assets. And again, you can see there are certain neighborhoods where it reflects the economic well-being model, and then other places where it doesn't. This was that social stress measure that I looked at. It's again associated a set of very severe social challenges that certain neighborhoods are facing in terms of issues around births, issues around child neglect, and actually I think included in this one is a measure of the number of homicide deaths that happen in a particular neighborhood. And again, making that point, you see certain neighborhoods where it's consistent with other dimensions and other places where it's different. And then finally, we have a lot of dimensions, but I can only hold your attention with so many. So this is school effectiveness. And again, this is based on things like test scores, student-teacher ratios, and dropout rates. Again, looking where in the city we're finding effective schools. So as I said, one of the things that we see as the benefit of taking this approach to social well-being is it allows us to look at first of all, two kind of extreme phenomena, what we think of as kind of concentrations of advantage and concentrations of disadvantage. Maybe people are squinting at the map. So essentially, it's because the legend's down here. So we found essentially 2 kind of places where we see kind of concentrations of advantage. So there's the center city area where again, looking at those maps, you'll see consistency in terms of positive scores. And then a set of neighborhoods, the ones that are in blue, where again we see this consistency. At the other end, we see these concentrations of disadvantage in the city. These are places where, whether you're looking at school effectiveness, social stress, whether people have insurance, personal health, consistently across the dimensions you're seeing problems. And again, those areas are the ones in brown on this map. But then you can see there's a very large amount of the city that's in between those two, what we are calling these mixed neighborhoods. That include, I think it's approximately a third of the population of the city lives in those mixed neighborhoods. So these are places where you can't neatly put them into one box or another. They're doing well on some dimensions, but not in others. I will say that, and again, I'm going out on a limb here. I think from the standpoint of arts-based strategies around revitalization, that these mixed neighborhoods are particularly important. If you have a neighborhood that is flat on its back across this whole set of dimensions, it's very hard to make the case that infusion of a few cultural resources into that neighborhood is going to totally turn it around. These neighborhoods that are in between, that have some strengths to build on but have big challenges, I think, provide the best opportunity for using arts-based strategies to bring about kind of measurable change. So that, I'm going on a limb there. I don't actually have the data to support that yet. And this just shows a map of those 4 different kinds of neighborhoods and shows how they stack up on our different dimensions. And again, obviously, those mixed neighborhoods are the ones that are pluses, strong on some and negative on others. Again, just recently in the past few months, we've been trying to move to say, okay, now that we've established these dimensions, how can we make sense of how the arts fits into those? And this presents just sort of a simplified model of how we're thinking about that. We see there being a set of social outcomes, in a sense, that are built into this index. The issues like social stress, personal health, school effectiveness, and security, which essentially is picking up on crime rates and cases of ethnic and racial harassment in the neighborhood. And we're saying, okay, to what extent can we demonstrate that the arts or any of those dimensions of social connections are making a difference in terms of changes in those dimensions? So if I state it that way, it seems like a straightforward analysis. But there is a complicating factor, which is essentially this, which is to say that one of the things we found is a very strong relationship between the presence of cultural resources in the neighborhood and its economic well-being. Well-off neighborhoods have more cultural resources. So in a sense, we need a kind of statistical approach that allows us to control for economic well-being in terms of looking at that connection between cultural assets and those sets of social outcomes. We found something else as we started to do this work, and this reflects something I mentioned earlier. Where is social connection most likely to make a difference? Well, what we discovered was that it was much more likely to make a difference in lower income neighborhoods. We looked at the bottom 40% in terms of income. And in a certain way, what we've discovered was that the social science literature kind of backed us up on that. That, you know, if you think about life as being made up of people possess and neighborhoods possess a range of assets. And those that we think, oh, I'm on the wrong thing, sorry. You know, ranging from financial assets like income and stocks to human capital like educational achievement and credentials, or to even cultural capital like tastes and knowledge of the arts. And finally, social capital, the kind of networks that people have in particular neighborhoods. One of the things that goes on is that people are able to translate one kind of capital into another. So, you know, if you're well connected, you can use that to, you know, get a job. You can use that to be in a position to translate your connections into financial benefit. One of the things that's come out of the social science literature is that low-income people, because they don't have the financial assets, because they don't necessarily have the human capital assets to translate, are much more dependent on social capital, on those social networks, to bring about positive change in their lives. So one of the things we wanted to investigate as we were doing this work was, could we find that to what extent did the presence of cultural assets in a neighborhood make more of a difference in low-income neighborhoods than in well-off neighborhoods? And we did that. So, you know, as I mentioned, one of the things we had to control for was this very strong relation. I know no one can read scatter plots. Essentially, each of these dots is a neighborhood in the city of Philadelphia, plotted both about economic well-being and the presence of cultural assets in the neighborhood. So the fact that there's this line that goes through it says that as neighborhoods' economic well-being goes up, their presence of cultural assets in that neighborhood also go up. I feel like I've got this sound effects between the boomers and whatever. I know I'm going on too long, so I'm not going to go into this, but actually this relationship is the one that keeps me awake at night. One of the things we discovered, as I mentioned, we've been doing this work for 20 years, and one thing we discovered summer before last when we did an analysis was that that correlation between economic well-being and the presence of cultural assets in a neighborhood doubled over a period of 15 years. And we're actually in the process of doing some work, and we discovered that that was associated with the fact that low-income neighborhoods had a very high, what we called mortality rate in terms of arts groups. We were able to link where groups came into being and where they died between 1997 and 2010 to 12, and we discovered that this mortality rate, where cultural groups were dying, was very high in low-income neighborhoods. That's the reason we're finding that this relationship is strengthening. We're currently trying to figure out, it's like a murder mystery, like what is causing that. I have a suspect, which is philanthropy, but I don't have the evidence to, I'm not ready to like put him in the room, them into the room and point to them and say, you did that. But essentially, this relationship is a problem, especially as it gets stronger. So what it meant in terms of this social well-being work is we had to control for that result when we looked at other relationships. So this gives an example. We looked at that social stress variable, again, focused on things like low weight births, cases of child abuse and neglect, high homicide rates. And we were able to control for the economic well-being, and we found still a very strong statistical relationship between the presence of cultural assets in that neighborhood and positive scores in terms of social stress. In fact, across those 4 dimensions, and all 4 of them, if we looked particularly at neighborhoods in the bottom 40% of the economic benefit, we were able to consistently find that cultural assets had a significant impact in producing positive outcomes across all 4 of those benefits, 4 of those. So as I mentioned, this is relatively early work. We basically had to spend 2 years constructing these indexes. We're just starting to look at the way of making sense of the relationship between where the arts fits in terms of making a difference in terms of these other aspects. We're currently, one of the reasons I'm in Austin is because we're currently doing a study where we're going to try to replicate these results in other cities. We've done some preliminary work in New York City. I know in Austin there's an issue around affordability of housing, but I'll tell you, having looked at the data, if you guys think you're bad off, just talk to someone who lives in New York. I have a daughter there, so I have a personal stake in this. We're doing some work in Seattle, and then we've done some preliminary work in Austin. I just wanted to show you it really to see if it sparks anything. So this is that economic well-being measure. Income, educational attainment, and labor force participation. I put it up there, and honestly, I was a little nervous that I pulled down a map of the new council districts, but I wasn't sure whether I absolutely had the right map, so I just put the numbers. I think they're right in terms of where the districts are, to give you a sense of that. So, you know, I guess it's no secret there's kind of this concentration of high economic well-being towards the east, towards the west, and higher concentrations of low economic well-being on the east side. This is that measure of economic and ethnic diversity. This essentially is one, we looked at the extent to which the economic profile of a particular census tract reflects the economic profile of the entire country. So are there rich people, poor people, and middle people in that particular place? And in terms of ethnic diversity, it was the extent to which a share of the population, what proportion of the population wasn't the member of the largest group in the neighborhood. So if the largest group is 70%, then their diversity score is 30%. If the largest group is only 30%, then their diversity score is 70. So this is how it came across in terms of economic and ethnic diversity. Again, we see a fair amount of homogeneity towards the West and greater diversity towards the East. And then finally, that measure of housing burden that I mentioned in terms of talking about New York. So this essentially is based on what proportion of the population is spending a high proportion of their income on housing. And this is based on, we use the 30% and 50% standards that the Census Bureau leads. And you can see, again, a high concentration of housing burden towards the East, but that actually, it's hard to characterize it because there are places across the metropolitan area where we see that. So, you know, as I mentioned, we've just started this work. But we see this as really a continuation of this emphasis on this kind of triangle that I started the talk with, where we want to, in a sense, take social well-being and make sure it stays in the conversation about what makes a good community and how the arts can make a difference in terms of not just a portion of the residents of a metropolitan area, but for all groups that live in a city. And I think that's it. This is our website. So I think that's it for me. Paul's right here.
Hi, Paul. Let me just do a little. So we're going to do a little shuffle here, a little stage shuffle. Is that how you want to do that? Sure. Okay, and so while you're doing that, I want to just help make another connection. There's so much synergy happening right here with the City of Austin, and just this year we've launched a needs assessment where we're going to be doing what we can to assess the needs of both individual artists, creative entrepreneurs, creative businesses, and nonprofits. And then coupled with now our cultural asset data mapping, which was funded, I think, this year through last year through the National Endowment for the Arts, and then now with Mark's project. So again, so much synergy happening, and with the Art Place partners and our town. I want to give a special recognition to Janet Seibert, who has been the partner with all of these grants and has really led the way for this creative placemaking conversation. If you could just stand up, Janet. We're all going to give you a big hand. She would normally be up here, but she is without voice, laryngitis. So at this point, I want to turn it over to Paul Bonin Rodriguez. He's instructor in UT College of Fine Arts, Theater and Dance, and he teaches performance as public practice. And do you have a microphone and everything that you need? We're working. Okay, a theater man. We need, okay, so we need mics.
But we're also going to give our mics over to the audience. Mm-hmm. Correct? Oh, perfect. Okay. So
Turn it over to you.
Are we good? Oh, we're good. Oh, Mark, thank you so much. That was just a rich sort of presentation, and it brought us to so many places we've been during these series of talks. And there were so many connections. One that sort of came up was that Maria Jackson had mentioned the Night Soul of the Community study and the ways that people attach to community, and there was some similarities to their attachment their 10 domain measure of attachment and your 13 domain measure of wellness, which I thought was really fascinating. I felt like you took it into more places around health and actual cultural participation through politics than the other study did. But that was, one thing I noticed right away. There's a question that came up for me, and I think it's really rich because at this moment in creative placemaking, it seems like, we have the big term, and we have sort of a sense of origins, and then we've got these sort of contestatory approaches to it, I would say. And one is the idea of a cultural practice that animates the nature of a neighborhood or town. So performances at night, a project that takes people, that puts people in a different sort of a mindset as they make their daily walk to work, right? But then there's also the relationship of the built environment that you talked about. And I wanted to know more about how a municipality's investment in culturally legible spaces affected this sort of wellness or even the cultural ecology measures. And I know you're really good with data. I know you're a data person, so you're not going to speak too much beforehand, but do you know what I'm saying?
I know what you're saying. I wish I had an answer, I guess.
Yeah.
I guess one thing I would say is I know, working with community arts people, that one of the things that drives them crazy is having to put up with substandard facilities. But from the standpoint of social impact, I'm actually not that convinced that the quality of the facilities makes that big a difference.
Okay.
That you can have as big a difference in a church basement as you can in a nice facility. So I guess I have a tendency. This may be growing out of our specific experience in Philadelphia, but we've seen so many small to medium-sized cultural organizations essentially run off the rails because they start focusing on building a facility. They neglect their program. They neglect building connections in their community. Can people hear me? I realize I'm wandering. So that I guess you'd say I have a prejudice. So I'm admitting that. So it's not really a data thing. That there's maybe sometimes too much emphasis put on facilities as against the kind of soft side of building a cultural ecosystem.
But you are implicit. But there is an importance of the permeability of a facility. Not necessarily. We're not going to classify the facility itself, but we're going to say the permeability, the legibility, and the fact that the facility itself is in conversation with a local community, cultural community, an active community.
I'm good with that.
Yeah, that seems somewhat apparent. And even the mixed and sort of promising neighborhoods among Philadelphia and where people are moving and making work at this point. And also, I think and this is my only other sort of question before I want to transition to what other people want to say. I have to ask, when we're asset mapping, what are we mapping towards at this point? In these projects, are we marking those legible, permeable, usable sort of spaces and places and neighborhoods, and sort of thinking towards how might we contribute or continue to add to them or amplify their purposes. And how might these investments in creative placemaking projects sort of think through what their anchoring role is over time.
And again, we think the biggest cultural asset to map are essentially people. Yeah. It's cultural participants, it's artists. So I think the facilities are, in terms of what you're saying as an anchor, as a place where the human arts resources can kind of link together, the facilities make a difference. But, I'm sorry. Again, I think sometimes the presence of the physical places obscures the importance of the human resources in terms of making a difference in neighborhoods.
Come on up. So 1 and then 2, okay?
Right. I want to ask, and I thought this was the question you were asking, but apparently not.
Oh.
I'm less concerned about the physical place of a facility, but wondering about the physical makeup of neighborhoods and the kind of investments that city makes in sidewalks, parks, open spaces, and how what's the correlation between the investments that we make in kind of our physical environment that can actually help people bump into each other in a sidewalk or in a park and those kind of things, and how do we start to make good decisions about where to make those kind of capital investments to most leverage the kind of outcomes that for social well-being and such.
I wish I had something good to say about this. Wait, do we? This is my silent partner, Susan Seibert.
Well, actually, if you look at I think Mark more or less said it, but forgot he said it, which is just that the mapping, it's Paul's question, so it's the mapping shows you the distribution of resources so that a place to start, especially with public investment or capital money, or what we say is there's a capital program in the city anyway. Where are they going to spend the money? So you could tie it, you can target to neighborhoods where there's already something on the ground, but it's invisible. It's the neighborhoods the students go to, but they can't see anything, where you can just do a bit, and it really, those public spaces connect things happening in buildings. The invisible resources can be connected through the public domain, and a city's capital program or a special initiatives investment can help leverage that. And that if the mapping and the resource, the asset inventories can help you, if you look at the geography, it will help you make decisions. But people our experience seems that people make decisions based on programs. The assessment of where to give money is based on building a program, a project. That the assessment is not made on how projects or existing resources cluster or don't cluster geographically. There may be neighborhoods with that really are more needy because they're so isolated resources.
Everyone should work with a city planner, though. I endorse that.
My question was basically answered. I was just wondering, because you were saying, I was just saying, I was just going to ask, because before you were saying how facilities aren't as important, but she kind of already answered my question about how accessibility is still very important, especially like you were talking about, close to public transit, especially because people living in poverty, usually that's one of their main means of transportation. So how do you kind of, I guess, you kind of already answered that, but striking that balance between finding an accessible location via public transportation, via the need, the demographic of a neighborhood, and and the affordability, especially in neighborhoods that are being gentrified. Like, how do you, I don't know, I just feel like that's a lot of different things to kind of come together to form like a perfect mecca, I guess, for arts.
True. And, you know, it's interesting in terms of the accessibility stuff. It's a study like, and when you're doing research, you come across things you don't expect to find, but they aren't what you're supposed to be researching, so you sort of put them aside. And one of the things we've never really gotten a handle on is how by different age groups impose a different spatial geography in terms of the use of the arts. You know, if you've got a 5-year-old, an accessible feature is one that's like close. But if you've got a 15-year-old, the last thing they want is to go to the same facility that they went to when they were 5. Well, in Philadelphia, they want to get on the subway, and they want to go to some other part of the city. So this issue of like how life cycle issues model what we mean by accessibility and what implications that might have for thinking about arts resources, you know, fits into that as well.
I guess I'm going to challenge you a little bit. My name's Ann Graham, a longtime arts activist here. Challenge you when you put yourself out on the limb there on the success of investing in those neighborhoods where all the social well-being indicators are very low. And I'm going to throw out Project Row Houses as an example, a really unique one. Rich Glow, who just got a MacArthur yesterday, pretty exciting. But that the one physical assets there, which references what you were just saying, Paul, happened to be these 22 gorgeous neglected homes that had a rich inherent cultural history, and you had a people there who didn't have social well-being due to economic depression, health woes, land use issues, and with that vision that unique individual Rick brought to that, allowed the social well-being indicators to be met, and therefore the heart and soul of the people to come forth in a culturally rich way. I don't know if that makes sense, and that's again just a unique example. But
no, I mean, as I said, I was going out on a limb, and you know, the big thing is one of the reasons we're interested in doing this study in other cities is because, you know, all the world is not Philadelphia. I can say in Philadelphia, my concern is that we have a very clear image of what essentially I'm saying, these consistently disadvantaged neighborhoods. We have a very fuzzy sense of these mixed neighborhoods, and we don't really mobilize ourselves in terms of how arts might make a difference in those neighborhoods. Right. So, you know, as I said, I'm a real admirer of Rick. I was so happy when I heard he won the MacArthur. He certainly deserves it. And, you know, as I was saying it, I said, I might be wrong on this. Right. You know, the arts can certainly serve important purposes in terms of neighborhoods with concentrated disadvantage. I think probably what's in the back of my mind is that actually it's easy to get people to focus on those neighborhoods, and it's harder to get people to focus on what I'm referring to as these mixed neighborhoods. Well, so I'll take that as a friendly correction.
I will say, too, between you're talking and Marcus and South Austin would die to have a lot of those industrial buildings that you have, turn-of-the-century industrial buildings. We don't have those here, one or two of them. So for artists, for transforming into artist spaces, we're devoid of those.
Well, we do have 40,000 vacant properties in Philadelphia, so if anyone wants to move any of them to Austin, we can probably work it out.
I'm a neighborhood person. I'm the vice president of my neighborhood association, and we participated in Imagine Austin. And I think I live in a mixed neighborhood that has all the things that you're talking about. We're on the bus line. We have the Chinatown. We have abandoned strip centers with open storefronts that would make excellent art studios and co-op galleries. We're near the Domain with the cataclysmic money that has come in and all of the high-income housing that's going in there in terms of apartments. What do I do to make my neighborhood a cultural asset? How do I help my neighborhood move into a cultural place that's rich, that embraces everyone who lives there, that has things that people want to come and see and do, and stay a neighborhood too, not be a Mueller or something that doesn't represent what the neighborhood is now currently.
Well, I think one of the things that's come out to us from our research, I guess, is that the first stage in terms of doing our research has always been what we call discovery. That neighborhoods have these resources, and they're to some extent invisible. We've had experiences in Philadelphia where people know the maps better, where people will say we've got it wrong. The first time we did a study, we discovered that the cultural participation rate in African American neighborhoods was pretty strong. And a newspaper reporter in town picked up the finding and did a little article on it. So the week after that, I got a letter in the mail. I open it, read it out, and the guy says, I don't know how they let people like you teach at a prestigious institution like the University of Pennsylvania. I've been a subscriber at the Philadelphia Orchestra for the last 30 years, and I can tell you that African Americans don't participate in the arts. And there's that sense that, one of the things that's been critical in terms of our work is to have an expansive notion of what we mean by cultural resources and cultural participation. And I think, and in order to realize that, you need kind of that discovery phase to see where, again, what Susan was saying, where are those strengths in the neighborhood to build on?
Hello, I'm a global economic researcher, and I'd like to share some of my findings. I've also been performing similar research. My friends in Germany have no interest in living in the USA because they are happy getting 6 weeks paid vacation, getting paid in the euro, which is a stronger currency than the US dollar. My friends in Australia, they have no interest in living in the USA because they're happy with their minimum wage at $16.87. In January, I will be arriving in Costa Rica, where people are happy with their strong connection with nature, and their country's motto is Pura Vida, pure life. And after personally spending time in 30 major cities across 12 different countries and 3 different continents, here is my preliminary findings in the form of a poem. Society is illusory. If we take society less seriously, we may experience less misery. We can transcend this illusion. We can transcend this system. We can transcend this matrix. We can transcend society if we see through the veil. And as long as flowers flourish and butterflies flutter, there are no worries. All is calm. All is well. All is peace. All is love. And as long as dragonflies and hummingbirds hover, there are no worries. All is calm. All is well. All is peace. All is love. And as long as the wind blows and the seasons change, there are no worries. All is calm. All is well. All is peace. All is love. And last but not least, as long as the moon and the sun continue to light up the sky, there are no worries. All is calm. All is well. All is peace. All is love. Thank you.
I'm not going to respond to that.
I had a question for you that you were actually just talking about right before the poem that I'd been sort of mulling over from the beginning of your talk, which is our first speaker, Rosa Maria, talked a lot about sort of the existing intrinsic art within a space, right? That there's always a history and that there's always artists and that there's always art that maybe we don't necessarily think about defining as art. And so the question is, in your cultural mapping, like you were just talking about, that you have a pretty broad definition of how you culturally map. You talked about it a little bit, but I was actually more curious about like what do you consider, aside from facilities or sort of like economic while being spaces that are very clear and defined as art spaces, you know, in a community. How do you map the not so defined spaces, and like what are you finding that those are defined as?
We kind of look all over the place. We go through weekly newspapers to see who's performing where in a neighborhood and what kind of groups are there. In terms of artists, you know, the way we construct our resident artist list is by getting lists of people who, more mainstream artists who are actually applying for fellowships and getting that, but also working with groups representing kind of a diverse set of organizations, working with organizations. So again, we're not that focused on facilities, and I would say we use if you say you're an artist in terms of our definition. So, and you know, I think one thing we found is that if you don't just say arts but talk about culture, that you're opening the door to people who might not see themselves as an artist but are interested in working in expressive, you know, media.
So you are talking about the cultural practices of, you know, a church choir performing, a craft fair on the weekend. You know, these are sort of broad sets of cultural practices that can be read as the way for people to participate.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say conceptually we're 100% there. It turns into a data challenge, you know,
yeah.
Finding out where you know, there's a lot that happens under the radar, and we try really hard to go below the radar. But what we've discovered is no matter how far below the radar you go, there's always something going on below where you looked. So like, for example, you know, like you'll be at a party and someone will mention, oh yeah, well, you know, me and 8 of my friends get together and go caroling every year. You know, we missed that. So we try, our purpose is to push down to pick up a wide range, but I think ultimately there's a data challenge about how comprehensive you can be.
We have a lot of tailgate parties in Austin, and they circulate around the university.
They sing at some point, I'm sure.
Yes, they do.
I think I had some in my hotel room, outside my hotel room last night.
I wondered if you had mapped the presence of children in the cultural districts, because we know that there's a high concentration of BAs and of young people and of rentals, whether that means a transient population or not. But I was wondering if maybe that translated to a lower concentration of children, or I'd just be really curious to know what the census data showed about that.
Well, it's sort of split a bit. I mean, again, if you look at there are some neighborhoods that have really high concentrations of young adults, and they tend to be non-family households, as the Census Bureau defines them, and there you're going to find lower rates of children. Again, where you have high concentrations of cultural resources in well-off neighborhoods, you're more likely to see more of a presence of kids. So it's sort of a split picture, I would say. If you look at the areas in the cities we're familiar with where there are high concentration of cultural resources, some of those neighborhoods, like sort of the neighborhood advantaged neighborhoods, you're going to find higher rates of kids. But in the center city and these kind of young adult districts, you're right, you're going to find fewer kids.
Thanks.
Hi. I'll make this. I have kind of a nitty-gritty. I have kind of a nitty-gritty question about Philly. I went to undergrad at University of Arts in Philly in the 90s, and I noticed on your graph that Fishtown Northern Liberties is kind of at the highest end of your graph. And
Yes.
and in the 90s, as you know, it was really dangerous. But I know when I was leaving in the late 90s, it was sort of burgeoning. What do you think that was that put one of the worst areas in Philadelphia? What was the trajectory that made it surpass, say, Powelton Village, which was ripe for a community of artists because of the schools? What was it? Was it developers? Was it cheap property? Was it an open slate?
Well, I think some of the features that we said kind of encouraged these natural cultural districts benefited Fishtown and Northern Liberties. I think that kind of combination of kind of old buildings and new uses. One of my undergraduates did her senior thesis on what's been going on in Fishtown, and I don't think it was primarily developer driven. I think it started off primarily as the artists, searching out affordable property near center cities. Yeah. And I think that's.
But in the 90s, most all of Philly was affordable. It really was.
Yeah.
It was a wide open city for the artists. I'm just wondering, was it space? Was it because the Northern Liberties, it didn't have great resources. It wasn't on any mass transit line. It was dangerous.
The NFL line is right up there, and you can take it in Fishtown. I just moved here from that area. Yeah. So it's like you can basically walk to every cool bar from the stop on the transit, basically.
And there's, in Philadelphia, if you look at neighborhoods that are turning over, there's also a racial side to it, which is that white kids moving in to a neighborhood that used to be white working class, I think you find less resistance, and I think that had something to do with it as well.
It was the white working class rather than.
So you don't see that racial flipping of neighborhood as frequently.
Right, that makes sense.
We're going to take 2 quick questions, and then we'll finish up, and I'll be stacking some chairs tonight.
Well, I'm looking forward to that.
Okay.
I wanted to thank Susan for her comment. Really, my question is directed to Susan, if you don't mind.
I don't mind.
It's easy to identify the places in a city like Austin that are the big entertainment districts, or the places where there are lots of shops. There's Congress, or there's, 6th Street. Those are easy to find. I was wondering if either of you had an opportunity to identify civic clusters in Austin.
No. We've just started doing work on the concentration of the cultural resources, and that's going to be a second iteration, but.
That's why you're all doing those cultural asset mapping.
Right. But it sounds like the cultural asset mapping is probably going to be a much longer and greater project, if you're any example of how long it takes to do cultural asset mapping. But it seems to me from your comments that really the opportunity to develop social equity, social well-being, and economic well-being is perhaps to focus and develop around the civic clusters, the civic cluster areas.
Yeah,
is that the
that
inference?
was something I think I was trying to get to, but I think you got to it better than I did. Yeah, we see these civic clusters as a particular opportunity.
Yeah, so I really look forward to seeing what you might find in terms of civic clusters.
I think your asset mapping project, we took a long time. We started before you have the internet, you have media, you have GIS. We were doing these things before these features, so it's not going to take you that long. You've got capacity here. Just pull it together, and you're moving.
I'll also help clean up. The lady just before with the long hair that came up, I think was actually getting the point that I'm kind of curious of. My mother's an artist. She purchased a loft. My family bought a loft, 1975 in New York, when trash was everywhere and they weren't cleaning up. And you could buy it for the price of less than you could buy a moderate-sized car today. She moved out in 2004, and the one thing that I noticed through time going back and visiting her, was the gentrification that occurred. So in New York, in Soho, right on Broadway, in the mid-'70s, there was really nothing around. There's not, you went up to NYU and to go to the clubs, or went down Triborough to, different areas on there were kind of niche. But through time, that all very changed. And so the question I'm asking is, as you look through these different studies, is that period of time, because I think it's really relevant. Most of the artists that I knew, that she knew, that were all in that area, the building is now an artist co-op. It took almost probably 11, 12 years to accomplish because of bureaucracy in New York City. But at the end of that, now there's many museums, there's lots of artsy places to go, but those artsy places that were there in the 70s and the early 80s are pretty much all gone. And they're replaced by new artsy places. And so I think the element of time is very precious in this discussion. And parts of Austin may not change as quick as in New York City. And that's the only thing that I'm really interested in, is that element of time, because these cultural assets, those families change, people change out, but they're just replaced by other assets that may be arts.
Well, someone brought up Northern Liberties in Philadelphia. When I moved into Philadelphia in 1978, people told me Northern Liberties was a gentrifying neighborhood. Eventually, by the 2000 teens, it actually did start to become middle class. And one of our arguments is that there's a difference between gentrification that happens like that and gentrification and revitalization that happens over decades. So I think you're right. The time frame is an important frame. But if we want neighborhoods to change. So we have to figure out a way of talking about neighborhood change where every change we see isn't gentrification, isn't labeled as gentrification. So.
Hello. I just want to say that this is the end of our presentation. I wanted to thank Paul, our moderator, for doing such a great job for this entire Creative Placemaking speaker series. Thank you so much. And I want to thank Dr. Mark Stern for doing such a great presentation on creative placemaking and the linkage to societal well-being, and how cultural asset mapping will only strengthen those linkages to making a better community for all, including in those areas that don't have as many assets, and then creating great spaces, especially cultural placemaking, will improve everybody's life. And I'm actually in charge of the Imagine Austin Speaker Series. My name is Kathleen Fox. I'm with the Planning and Development Review Department. I just want to announce our next Imagine Austin Speaker Series. It's going to be on October 29th. And we're going to be talking, we're going to get a speaker from the Texas Workforce Commission. His name is Richard Froschel. He's going to be at City Hall Council Chambers. And he's going to talk about how you can find a great job making a very decent salary without getting a 4-year college degree. And this, again, is part of Imagine Austin, of trying to find jobs for people without them having a master's degree and being able to live and work here comfortably. So that is our next Imagine Austin Speaker Series, again, October 29th. And again, I want to thank everybody for coming on this very stormy, wet day. I mean, a lot of you were sopping wet. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Paul, again.